Hello, this is Mr. Smith with Academic Government Economics. This is the next lecture in the third unit of economics. So today we'll be talking about labor, and the slide says inputs to production. So let's talk about the factors of production: labor, natural resources, which is often called land, and technology, which include capital. So land, labor, and capital. We'll be concentrating on the labor part in particular. The first slide here talks about the demand for labor, and it can be tracked just like anything else. So, for instance, in microeconomics, we talk about the quantity and price of each product, and we often just think of these as just goods that we can buy, but it also includes services and it also includes labor, because all of us are sellers or suppliers of labor into the marketplace. And so the demand for labor actually comes from businesses. Businesses, government, other organizations that employ people, they're the ones purchasing the labor. And so this marketplace is actually flipped around. In most places, it's the businesses that provide, but in this case, it's the businesses or the employers that demand. They're purchasing labor from us, the people. And so this is tracking, for instance, number of employees and their output. As you can see here, 0 employees, 0 number of toys produced per hour. And this column here is the marginal product of labor. That is the difference or the change in labor that has occurred with each additional employee hired. So we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the whole way up to 10 employees. With 1 employee, they're producing 6 toys per hour. And so they have improved their marginal product of labor by 6 because they've gone from 0 to 6. Then 2 employees produce 11. And so they've improved from 6 to 11, which is 5. So that's their marginal product of labor, and so on. And typically we think of, the more people you hire, the more you keep making. But that's not always necessarily true, because with the marginal product of labor, the law of diminishing returns applies as well. So at first you have positive returns, so it might be going up. And you can see it comes in waves here. At first it goes up, then it goes up again here, then it goes up again here. So it is possible to have positive marginal returns, but then you have diminishing marginal returns is when it's going up, but not as much as it was before. So, for instance, this is still positive. It's still going up to 11, but it's not going up as much as that first time when it went from 0 to 6. Now it's only going from 6 to 11, which is 5. So this is diminishing marginal returns here, because this number is less than the previous one. That's not the case there. But there you can see it happens again. And eventually we have, when it goes from 7 to 1, so is there something wrong with this 5th employee? I don't know, but you have diminishing marginal returns again. And then when you get to negative, you're hiring more people and it's actually dropping. Maybe it's too crowded, maybe there are too many distractions, maybe there aren't enough tools to make the toys. It's hard to say, but there can be a variety of reasons, and of course that's why you end up eventually having negative marginal returns. And we can keep adding people, and it will fluctuate some more and more and more, and then you'll see more red numbers until it's just red number after red number after red number, unless we change something else. The amount of space they have, the tools they have, and so on, keeping them further apart so they aren't distracted, or whatever the case might be. So the law of diminishing marginal returns ensures that in most industries, the marginal product of labor will eventually be decreasing. The law states as units of one input are added, with all other inputs held constant, so the space, the tools, and everything, a point will be reached where the resulting additions to output will begin to decrease, and that is, of course, marginal product that is declining. The law of diminishing marginal returns applies regardless of whether production function exhibits increasing, decreasing, or constant returns to scale. So the key factor is that labor is increasing, but other factors remain the same. So the marginal product of labor is, of course, as you can see here, revenue. In this case, marginal product of labor up here is physical. The marginal product of revenue, or the marginal revenue product of labor, is the change in revenue that results from employees' additional unit of labor. So how much more are we getting out of this with each person hired? So the marginal product of labor, or the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL, is the change in revenue that results from employing an additional unit of labor holding all other inputs constant. And so the question is, how much is hiring this additional person going to change the overall revenue? And we can calculate that marginal revenue product of labor by calculating the change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. So whatever the change has happened in the revenue, if it's gone from making $100 and with this new employee we're making $200, the change is 100. 200 minus 100 is 100. And we've changed by one employee, so 200 divided by 1. So that would be the marginal revenue product of labor. So firms will demand labor until that marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the wage rate. So firms purchase demand. They demand labor, they purchase it, so they're the ones that are demanding. And of course, they want those people that are laboring to increase production. So the cost of labor to a firm is called the wage rate. So how much they're paying out is known as the wage rate instead of price, like we call it in the other marketplaces. This can be thought of as the firm's marginal cost. The additional revenue generated by hiring one more unit of labor is the marginal revenue product of the labor. This can be thought of as the marginal benefit. So the marginal revenue product of labor, MRPL, is the marginal benefit. So the cost is their wage, and then that change that's happening in revenue because of the increase in labor is the marginal benefit. We can see on the screen right now, this is the optimal demand for labor. So when we plot it out, you can see it slopes downward, just like it would in the normal marketplace. It might have more of a curve to it. The optimal demand of labor is located where the marginal product equals the real wage rate. The curved line represents the falling marginal product of labor. The y-axis is the marginal product wage rate, and the x-axis is the quantity of labor. So this is the quantity of labor, and this is the marginal product wage rate. And so this is the wage rate right here. This is the optimal quantity that's going to be produced. So a lot of these terms should sound familiar from earlier when we talked about microeconomics. So the MPL falls as the amount of labor employed increases. So we're hiring more employees, but this output is falling. And so that's another sign of why, some people think, if we just have more and more people working, we can do better, but that isn't always necessarily the case. Now, of course, this whole demand curve can shift. It can increase by shifting to the right, and it can decrease by shifting to the left. So either of those directions is possible. So what kind of things can cause it to shift? Changes to the marginal product of labor. Technology, for instance, may increase the marginal product of labor, shifting the demand curve to the right. So we start using automated assembly lines with these workers making toys, it will go in this direction. The prices of other factors can also increase, or can increase or decrease. So if the prices, for instance, of the materials you need to make those toys increases, so all the ingredients you need for them goes up, then you're not going to be able to produce as much. So this will actually shift to the left. And of course, the opposite is true. If you see a decrease in the costs, then it's going to shift in the right. And the price of the firm's output. Since the price of the output is a component of the MRPL, changes will shift the demand curve of labor. If the price that a firm can charge for its output increases, for example, the MRPL will increase. This is reflected in an outward shift of the demand for labor. So this shows you the marginal product and wages. The graph shows the factor of production, in our case labor, has a fixed supply in the long run. So the wage rate is determined by the factor demand curve, in our case the marginal revenue product of labor. So we have the demand, we have the supply, and of course this is the equilibrium. So over the long run, so this would be possibly years, this particular occupation, the best wage or price for their labor is going to be here. Now, in the short run, this line or curve would actually be like this. So it'd be like other markets where we've seen kind of like an X marks the spot type of scenario. The reason why it is straight up and down in the long run is because in the long run, people are going to be willing to work for any type of wage. So this is, of course, one of the controversies, especially involving minimum wage. People will say, well, just let employers charge whatever they want. But the problem is that people will work. I mean, they will work. Human beings traditionally aren't lazy. We want to eat. We want to be able to buy things. So people will work even if the wage is incredibly low. And so people will be willing to supply their labor no matter what over the long run. In the short run, they'll say, oh, maybe I'm going to form a union and go on strike, or maybe I'm just going to sit at home and not until they start raising their wages, or maybe I'll move around until I find a job. And so in the short run, this supply curve is going to be sloped, but over the long run, everyone's going to eventually get around to getting a job. And so the line is going to be horizontal. But that's also an argument you could use in favor of raising a minimum wage, because you could point out, well, people will work no matter what, and they'll even work if they're not making enough. And so even if they're not making enough to get by to afford all the basic necessities, people will still end up in the long run going to work. And so that could be an argument used against the minimum wage. But that, I digress, that's not what this is talking about. Here we're talking about the equilibrium, and over the long run you can see where it is. And even if it was over the short run, we might have a supply curve like that, and the equilibrium wage is going to be where those two lines intersect. And so the question is, besides the equilibrium, what else can help influence the overall price of labor? Well, this first one on the screen, or the second one, I guess, the wage rate, that is determined by the equilibrium. So that's pretty much, in a nutshell, one of the major reasons why wages are paid for certain areas. And of course, we already talked about some of the changes that can happen in the supply and demand of labor. Technology would be one of them. Prices of the output, which affects the unit of labor, and the price of labor relative to other factors of production. Those things can all change where the supply and demand curves are, and they can shift both to the left and the right. We already talked a little bit about that. And of course, those can change the actual equilibrium. And I know this one says firm demand for capital, but let's pretend this is for labor. And this would be over the short run. You can see shifts that will happen when that occurs. So the demand for labor, what businesses want, that could cause it to shift this way. And if there's an increase for demand, if more employers want this particular type of labor, then that is going to cause a new demand, for instance, that might be here. And so there'll be a higher wage paid out to those employees if a lot more people want to hire them. The same thing with supply. If all of a sudden you have a big increase in the number of people, for instance, let's say this is the wage for nursing, and the word is out there that, oh, we need a lot more nurses, so a lot more people go into the field, that's going to increase supply, which is going to shift it in this direction. And so you're going to have a new supply curve that might be here, and so the equilibrium wage is going to be lower eventually. So the more people that you want to have to do a job, then it's going to be a lower wage. People ask, why do professional athletes and musicians and other people that are famous especially get paid a lot? Well, there is a high demand to be entertained by those individuals, but there's a low supply of people that have the talent and the marketing ability to get to that point. So the supply curve for professional athletes and other entertainers is way back here. And so you can see in that case, the demand intersection is where the equilibrium is going to give them an incredibly high wage. Dangerous jobs that require a lot more training, the supply curve is going to be over this way because there are going to be less people. So you're going to have a decreased supply curve, and so the wage is higher. Some other things that can change would be compensation differentials. Some differences in wage rates across places, occupations, and demographic groups can be explained by compensation differentials. And what we mean by that, a differential is a qualitative or quantitative difference, so either the quality or the number difference between similar or comparable things. And so let's look at some of these differentials. One of them is education. So obviously, the more educated someone is, and this isn't true in all cases, there are obviously individual outliers, but in most cases, as education increases, so does the wage of those people. So if we're using this graph again, the people with a high school education, the supply curve could be here. The people with a college education is going to be back here. And so the wages are going to be higher. Once again, that's not always true because there are other things that could make the supply of an occupation lower. It's dangerous. It's not a pleasant job. It could take lots of skill that maybe didn't require a college education, but maybe required a trade school and an apprenticeship and so on. So the supply of labor is also going to be lower. So education can also include not just what we think of as traditional higher education, but a totality of education and training. So the more of that is required, the less people you're going to have supplying that particular type of labor, so therefore the higher the wage. Another compensation differential would be geographic compensation. Certainly, parts of the country are more attractive than others, and labor is mobile. It has been for a long time in the United States. And so more workers will end up moving to an area. And so obviously that is going to greatly increase the supply of labor, which depresses wages. Then there's, of course, discrimination. In the United States, minorities and women make lower wages on average than people of European descent. Some of this that are men, some of this is due to historic trends that result in less human capital or concentration in certain lower paying occupations. So, for instance, there's a lag effect. Even though de jure or legal discrimination was gotten rid of a few decades ago, there are still people alive who lived through it. And the problem is that for another generation or two, you have lesser incomes, lower housing values, therefore lower property taxes, therefore less revenue put into the school districts that those individuals live in. And so their education might not be as high of a quality. And so there are lingering effects that can occur that cause, of course, the lack of some of the variables that are necessary in order to have a higher wage. So this can impact people over the long run. And of course, we do see individual cases where discrimination occurs, but that's, of course, not officially. But it can impact the overall average, even if you only have a few, 5 to 10% of the population that discriminates against women or people of various ethnicities. That can still cause an impact on the overall average wage of a particular group. And then there's also compensating differential, which don't get that confused, of course, with compensation differential. One of the types of compensation differentials is the compensating differential. And this is a term used in economics to analyze the relation between wage rate and unpleasantness or other undesirable attributes to a particular job. And so, for instance, being a police officer has a lot of hazards that go with it. And so there's a supply of less people willing to do the job. It's police officers, firefighters, and it doesn't even have to be jobs that are dangerous when it comes to violence or going into a risky environment. It could be people that you don't necessarily think of. Garbage collectors, for instance, have a higher rate, especially in warmer, more humid climates, of getting diseases, for instance. And so there's a lesser supply. And so that causes the wage to be a little bit higher. And it's different from job to job. Obviously, some jobs are incredibly unpleasant, but enough people are willing to do them, it negates the unpleasantness. And so the supply is good enough that the wage continues to be high. So it has to be unpleasant, but also unpleasant to the point or difficult enough to a point where there's not a lot of people willing to do that job. So the supply is low and the wage is high. The next thing I'll mention is performance and pay. And there's a direct connection between job performance and pay, but there are also other factors that help distort this. And so, according to economic theory, a worker's wages are equal to the marginal revenue product of their labor. If one employee is very productive, he or she will have a high marginal revenue product. One additional hour of their work will produce a significant increase in output. So, in other words, they're incredibly productive. They're going to have a high return for the employer, the one who's demanding their labor. It follows that the more productive employees should have higher wages than less productive employees. Imagine if this were not true. A firm decides to pay a highly productive worker less than the marginal revenue product of their labor. Any other firm would make a profit by offering a higher salary to attract that person over to their company, and the worker's wage would eventually rise. Theoretically, therefore, there is a direct relationship between job performance and pay. But we know that's not always the case. In every single employable situation, obviously in firms or other organizations, there's somebody that doesn't work as hard, but maybe does get paid as much. So wages are determined not only by one's productivity, but also seniority, because people that have been there for a while are learned, they have the experience, they know different situations that come up. They might even be able to take over if they need to fill in for a manager briefly. And so seniority is also rewarded because you want people who are loyal. You don't want people, the best workers you might have under 1 year, but what happens if they only ever stayed for 6 months at a time? So seniority and loyalty certainly count. Networking, ambition, and sometimes chance all play a role in pay. It's very rare for an entry-level worker to make the same wage as an experienced member, for instance, and sometimes discrimination is also responsible for some of these differences. But this chart is looking at productivity and average real earnings. And so this is on a macroeconomic level. Starting in the year 1975, the relationship between the productivity of labor and the wage rate in the United States. And so this is an index of the productivity, and this is the productivity compared to real earnings, and this of course would be the year. So this goes actually all the way back to 1945, but we start to see a disconnect here in 1975. And so these are the real wages of goods being produced, and this is the major sector of productivity. And a lot of this is because of technology. And so people are more productive. And a lot of this is also because you started to see the effect of mandatory truancy or education, school attendance, and so on. And so despite the fact workers are much more productive than ever before, and you sometimes hear people say, well, people used to be a lot harder working, people used to make a lot more. But that's actually not true, because we're making more than ever before. And then wages has certainly not increased as much. If it were the case that productivity would be awarded, then these lines should still be equivalent with each other, but that isn't the case, as you can see here. One of the things about the supply of labor is that over the long run, especially the higher the price gets, we can actually see this kind of reversed or backward bending supply curve. And you might wonder, well, why does this happen? Now, remember, this is people offering or selling their labor. So this is the employees selling their labor, the workers. And typically we can see it follows the law of supply. As the price rises, so the wage goes up, then we have more people supplying their labor. More people want to work. But then you eventually get to a point where as the prices rise, you start to see the supply go back in the other direction. You might wonder, well, why would the quantity, let's say this is at $100 an hour, and let's say this is $300 an hour, why are the same amount of people willing to work? And then if we get the whole way up here to like $400 an hour, why are a lot less people willing to work? The reason why is because people are making enough money at a certain point, and they're saying, well, I don't need to work for this much higher of a wage. I would like to have more time off. I have all this money. And this is a problem. People that are away from home a lot, that make a lot of money, like truckers, for instance, they start to ask eventually at some point in their lives, what am I going to do with all this money? I'm not able to spend it with my family. I'm not able to use it for leisure time. And so eventually you get people that have made enough money or making enough an hour, they start to say, well, maybe I don't need to put in as many hours. And so that is why sometimes we have this backward bending supply curve. A couple other things I want to mention when it comes to the supply of labor is what type of skill level is required. And generally, this also, but doesn't always, relate to education. We generally have different levels of labor that take place. And usually the lower on this scale, the bigger the supply of people, absent other variables, that is. And so therefore there is a large supply, and the wages are going to be lower. And so the lowest level will be unskilled labor that requires virtually no training at all, maybe just a day or two at the most. Here's a broom, sweep this floor, clean these toilets. And so almost anybody can do that job. So there'll be a large supply of people that can do it. And so the wage is going to typically be low, absent other variables. If you're cleaning a toilet next to a nuclear reactor, obviously less people are going to want to do that. So that when you increase danger or hazards, then obviously it changes it. But all absent other variables, unskilled labor, lots more people are going to be able to do it. And so the wage is going to be lower. The next level will be semi-skilled labor, and these are people that are trained to use basic machinery, electric or digital of some type. It doesn't take too long of training, maybe just a couple weeks, and they're able to operate this basic equipment, and so therefore there's a few less people that are able to do this, and so therefore the supply of labor is going to be a little bit less, and the wage is going to be a little bit higher. Then we get into skilled labor, and this is going to take long-term training, and they're able to operate complex equipment. And so maybe they're handling complex machinery inside a factory. And so skilled labor will have an even smaller supply of laborers, and they are going to get paid more than semi-skilled and unskilled labor. And so skilled labor is the third of these groups. And the fourth group would be professional. We could put a lot of people in here, people that go to trade schools, people that have to apprentice for a long time, people that go to college and above. Any of those would fall into the professional category. They require months, maybe even years of training. And they can not only work with complex equipment, but they can also work with people in many cases. Or they're trained to work with such complex equipment that it can be incredibly dangerous if they don't work with it properly or costly. Then those people qualify as professional. And they have the lowest supply of labor, and therefore they have the highest wages. Now, one of the problems with college education recently is because, unfortunately, and some of this is societal, people say, oh, college, that's the cream of the crop. And so people want to send their kids there. And so that has created a bulge in the labor supply when it comes to people seeking college education. And so there are jobs today that only pay below $20 an hour that they require a college degree for. And that's because so many people have decided to go to college and at least have some college or a bachelor's degree. And because of that flood of people, wages for college educated people are still higher, but they're not nearly as high as they had been in the past compared to some other occupations. The problem is right now, and you see this a lot, especially on social media, high skilled jobs that, and you might even be able to include them as professional if they require a lot of training: plumbers, carpenters, masons, boilermakers, electricians. There aren't a lot of people going into that, and so they have really high wages. And so people point out, wow, you could go into one of these and you can make a lot more than you go to college. And it's not necessarily that they're easier or more difficult to get into, or that necessarily their work is more valuable. It's just not a lot of people are going into it because those jobs require a lot of patience and technical skill. And there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily willing to do it, at least not at this point in time. So the government, both the federal, state, and local level, and schools have been promoting trade schools a lot more often. So hopefully we get enough people to go into those jobs. But when that does happen, if a lot of people go into it, then obviously the wages are going to decrease. And so that's one of the problems. You hear about a field or occupation that has a lot of demand but not enough supply, and so you might think, oh, I'll go into that. But the problem is if it takes a while to become trained to get into that field, and by the time you get into it, perhaps those wages aren't going to be realized as much as before. And the last thing that I want to talk about would be organized labor. And organized labor can trace their roots back to guilds that you might have learned back in middle school. Back in the old days in Europe, up until the Renaissance, maybe a little bit further than that, you had skilled artisans or carpenters or people like that, and they belonged to groups. And in order to be admitted as an apprentice, you had to go through so many steps. Then you apprenticed for so many years, and then you worked as independently but under supervision, and you could belong to the guild until you eventually receive full membership. And based on these guild prices, people would have to pay higher wages for their services. Eventually, over time, though, obviously the world changed. Europe explored the Americas, the United States was set up, and then the first wave of industrial revolution went through. That happened in Europe, actually, earlier than the American Civil War. America has generally been thought of as only having one industrial revolution. That would be post-Civil War, post-1865. But actually, at that time, then Europe was on its second industrial revolution, mostly in northwestern Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, northern France, and the United Kingdom. But anyway, when this happened, you start to see a lot of people moving away from individual work, individual artisans, individual farmers. That's where most of the people were. And so they started coming into cities and towns and working in factories. And of course, this is a very loose idea at the beginning, not like the Henry Ford, assembly line type of thing we're thinking about. But in the 1800s, a lot more dangerous jobs or routine jobs that didn't have a lot of individual focus. And when people started to get into this, they started to think about how they were doing all this work and productivity was increasing, but they didn't really see an increase in wages. And plus, there were a lot of dangers. And if you got hurt in the job, if you got killed or maimed, then your family was out of luck. There was no such thing as workers' compensation insurance or sick leave or any of those types of things. And people often have to work 6, 7 days a week, 12, 14, 16-hour days. Children were employed, especially in small, tight places that were still incredibly dangerous. Women were hired sometimes because for work that people thought was stereotypical for women or acceptable, sometimes because they had smaller hands and they, just like children, they could get into smaller places, but it was still dangerous. And often because children were smaller, because women, they were considered more fragile or they were taken care of by their husbands or fathers, people in those groups didn't always get paid as much, even if they were doing the same amount of work, even if they were more productive. And so all of these challenges started to come up, and eventually people started to look into forming unions. At first, it happened within skilled areas. And so you had people within skilled, similar occupations formed trade or craft unions. And they were kind of discriminatory. And I don't just mean that in some kind of racial or sexist sense, although they could be. They were more discriminatory in a way that, we are the carpenters, and there might be other people working for this company, but we are the only ones allowed to belong to this union. So they didn't really give them a lot of bargaining power, but it did some, and some early unions were successful. Groups like the Knights for Labor, for instance, some of the earlier champions of unions like Samuel Gompers, they promoted, of course, this idea that workers should be allowed to collectively bargain. The problem was there was no clear legal definition of that, and some states, friends, of course, with some of the wealthy business owners, decided to curtail union activity. So it might be illegal to join a union. It might be illegal to go on strike. It might be illegal to assemble to meet as a group of workers. And sometimes unions went ahead and organized anyway and went on strike no matter what. And when that happened, of course, and especially if you employed 1,000 people, you couldn't find 1,000 people to fill in their jobs right away. So that put the company in a bind. Sometimes the companies would give in, and sometimes they would resist. And if they resisted, they would eventually call in police or call the governor to eventually send in the National Guard, or back then it was called the militia, in order to break up the strike. And sometimes that resulted in some violence. For instance, the Homestead strike, which happened in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is in the Pittsburgh area, this violence was anticipated. Andrew Carnegie, one of his managers, Frick, what's his name, basically said, take care of this, and Andrew Carnegie ran off out of the country to avoid it, and Frick ended up eventually hiring the Pinkertons, a detective agency, to come in and break up the union. The union officials caught word of this, and they took over the steel mill. They barricaded themselves inside, and so there was eventually violence and gunfire exchanged. And eventually the union was broken. And this kind of made people leery of early unions because they were worried about the violence that would occur. People were blacklisted if they were thought of as being sympathetic or joining unions. The employer would call around to all the other companies, even their competitors, and say, don't hire this person. And so unions had a really tough go of it. Eventually, unskilled laborers or different types of laborers joined other types of unions. And so these general unions that occurred were different than the craft or skilled labor unions, where anyone could belong no matter what the type of occupation. And they usually were more open-minded. In the North, some of them even pushed to include women and people of African American descent. In the South, that was still incredibly unpopular for obvious reasons. And so you did end up having more and more unions start, and then eventually they would focus around certain types of industries. The United Coal Miners, for instance, would be one of them, and the United Steelworkers, which originally had a different name. And eventually multiple unions started to form, and so they started to say, well, maybe we need legislation to protect us, so we need to lobby for that, so we need to join together. So eventually two different groups formed, the American Federation of Labor and also the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Both of these, the AFL more likely represented skilled labor, the CIO represented more of these mixed or unskilled laborers, and these were umbrella groups that multiple unions belonged to, so they could lobby and try to contact elected officials to convince them to be able to have more legal activities. But it really wouldn't be until the Great Depression, when a lot of people were miserable, a lot of people saw themselves basically being taken advantage of at the workplace by not making enough money during these dreadful times, that you started to see sympathy, and eventually members of the Democratic Party, particularly Franklin Delano Roosevelt, started to push through organized labor legislation. And probably the pinnacle of that would be the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was passed in 1938, which helped establish, for instance, the minimum wage, making child labor illegal, establishing a 40-hour work week, and if you did work over 40 hours, you had to get paid 1.5 or time and a half times your regular wage, known as overtime pay. So that would only be there because of organized labor. Going back, That of course would be 1938. And before then, you have to go the whole way back to 1869 when the Knights of Labor were founded. And Samuel Gompers helped found the American Federation of Labor in 1886. And so intermixed with that were a number of strikes, including some terrible events. 1886, 11 were killed and 50 injured in the Haymarket riot, which made unions look responsible. It was actually a few anarchists that infiltrated the event. But it fueled anti-union sentiment. There was a strike of railroad workers that was halted by the courts, so they still had legal problems in 1894. 1900, just showing women sometimes had a hard time getting to unions. They decided to form their own. So in 1900, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was founded. And then eventually they went on strike and got better pay by 1910. But there was still a lot of hazards because pay and benefits weren't the only things they were looking for. Unions also wanted to make workplaces safer because in 1911, there was a fire in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York that killed 146 people and injured a number of others. And so unions started to push more for safety as well. In 1919, after World War I, there were a number of strikes. People held off during the war for the most part, and so afterwards there was a wave of them. People were anxious to keep pushing for higher wages, and so that once again raised fears amongst the public. In 1919, also, John Lewis became the president of the United Mine Workers, leading a huge successful strike on their behalf. And so some of the first laws weren't passed, like I said, into the Great Depression. 1932, the Norris-LaGuardia Act outlawed yellow dog contracts, which were fake kind of company tricks into making it look like workers had a good deal, but they really didn't. It gave protections to unions. 1935, the Wagner Act gave the right to workers to organize. And then, like I said before, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was created. So by 1940, union membership had peaked at 35% of the labor force. But during World War II, because of fears of inflation, FDR asked his allies in unions, hey, don't have a lot of strikes right now because we don't want to drive up prices because that will drive up inflation too much more. So during World War II, in order to attract employees, companies would instead offer things like health insurance. So a lot of unions got that into their contract. It was incredibly inexpensive. People didn't live for a long time past retirement back then. And there were a lot of medical problems. Well, to be honest, people just died from them. So medical costs weren't incredibly huge, and neither was insurance. So employers gladly added that to workers' compensation and benefits. But after the war, of course, once again, there was a slew of strikes. People said, hey, companies have been making a lot of money during the war, so now we want part of that. So because of all those strikes, eventually in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, which established right-to-work laws. Right-to-work law says if you work at a company that has a union, and the union has negotiated a higher wage and better benefits, and sick days and vacation days and all that, you get all that stuff, but you don't have to belong to the union. So that causes a problem because at first one person says, oh, I don't want to belong to a union, then a second person and a third person. Then eventually, if you have more than 50% that don't belong to the union, the company will ask for an election to see whether or not there should be a union there. And if 50% plus one person vote no, then the union is dissolved and there goes away your contract. Southern states are more likely to be right to work, and they often have some of the lowest wages and lesser benefits. So this started to decline the amount of people unionized in the private sector, and eventually you started to see more unionization of government workers in particular. And there are some low-skill labor areas where you see unionization. In 1962, for instance, Cesar Chavez began organizing farm workers, for instance, but you still saw mostly the focus on public sector or government unions starting to increase in particular. Today, less than 10% is unionized, and a lot of the laws that are in place to protect laborers are there because of unions. But of course, those laws could always be reversed, which is why unions argue that they still are necessary. So there are different ways that people can get income, including through unions, but also through getting an education, having more specialized skills. But there's also the difference between a wage and your overall income. Is wage is how much you're earning per certain unit, hour, week, year, whatever. Income would be your total amount of money made. And so recent growth in overall income inequality has certainly come up in the news a lot. And people wonder, like, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Can this be fixed? Should we fix it? How could the government fix this, or should the government get involved? And globalization has contributed to some portion of the rising inequality, as jobs basically have moved into two directions. You have people that, for instance, used to have middle of the road jobs in the semi-skilled and skilled area that worked in factories, but those factories have either been replaced by outsourcing, factories shipped overseas, or they've been replaced by technology. So we've seen more people shifting over toward the unskilled in the lower end of the semi-skilled area and people over to the professional area. And so we end up with a big gap between the people in the top half and the people in the bottom half in particular. So this has happened because of labor market outcomes, globalization, technological changes, policy reforms, regressive taxation, which can happen sometimes, and sometimes discrimination. Income inequality has increased over the last few decades, and recent studies have stated that the wealthiest 400 Americans control nearly 50% of, or half of, the domestic wealth. And so we look at this particular curve, is Kuznets curve, and it depicts the relationship between inequality and income. After hitting a market peak, inequality will decrease as income increases. Recent economic trends have caused researchers to believe that the economy may have started on a new Kuznets curve given the heightening economic inequality. And so looking at this curve, we can see inequality on the vertical axis, income per capita on the horizontal axis. And so as income increases, we will see, and this is average income, the inequality increase. And then after we move along to here, we can see it start to decrease again. That's the general belief. We go through growing pains, problems, rehashing the labor market, and then eventually everything settles back into a new place. So there's the belief that we'll have new jobs that will be created that will help replace those middle factory workers. Perhaps many of those former factory workers or people that would have been destined to go there will go into those higher skilled or lower professional areas, or perhaps places that require a lot of training, but they involve a lot of skill, like plumbers and electricians. And we'll have those people fill out. And so we'll eventually go back up to this point here. So maybe that will happen, maybe it won't, or not up here, but eventually we'll go back down where income is increasing, but we have less inequality, because if we had more people go into those other jobs, we'd see the income spread out over much more of the population. But certainly we can see U.S. income over time. This is since 1947 till today. Once again, productivity has gone up. Real median family income started to stagnate right around here. This is where we started to see technology introduced. Some liberal politicians point out this is also where taxes on the wealthy were dropped drastically. Of course, we don't have a lot of evidence to support one way or the other if that's true or not, if that had some kind of impact on the inequality. But you do have some on the left calling for higher taxes on the rich. But the question is, then what do you do with that money? And how do you get that back to average American families so the real median income rises? But we started to see before COVID struck that this number, and this only goes up to 2011, but it did start to increase a little bit. And the question is, if the economy had gone on uninterrupted, would that have happened anyway? But either way, income inequality is there, and it angers some people. And the question is, how many people will it anger, or that cause tension to go up and people asking for something to be done about it? Generally, we break up the income of the people basically into brackets. We break up people into 20% categories. So there's the lowest 20%, there's the next 20%, there's another 20% on that, and so on up to the top 20%. And the top 20%, those are often referenced as they control, a significant amount of the American wealth. They also do get taxed more under the federal progressive income tax, and they do make up a large amount of the government's budget. But because of that huge gap in the bottom 20%, they control less than 5% then of the total income. Then that obviously causes some political tension. Now, you may disagree with it completely. You might say, well, income inequality is just a result. If people want to change individually, they need to go out and get a better education or training or a different job and so on. And that's all true, but that doesn't change that people still are upset about it. And the question is, from a social science perspective, how do we address that? The Other issue, of course, is there's not only the income gap, but there's also a wealth gap. Income is how much you're making year to year over the long run. Wealth is how much you accumulate over your lifetime. And there's also a large wealth gap growing as well. And that can be caused by lack of inheritance, the fact that people aren't passing things along, that too much debt is experienced during a lifetime. And that can also increase awareness and increase tension at the same time. So that is just a little bit about labor and income in this particular marketplace. And remember that there are a lot of variables that interact in this situation, and that each individual occupation kind of has its own market where there are people willing to work in that job and people who are, or employers who are demanding them.